One of the things we're seeing is a lot of people are saying, oh, the inflation is not real because it's just based on COVID supply constraints.
Are we in sort of a war today? I mean, how do we compare peacetime finance to World War II era finance?
Well, so far, I mean, it's kind of similar because, they're essentially using the pandemic as the external threat to be, fighting, as well as just it's one of those things where COVID is just one part of it. The real kind of issue there is you had such a highly leveraged system that when you had a supply chain disruption, it could have been anything. It could have been, a volcano goes up in a crazy place. You could have had, some other natural disaster. So anything kind of disrupts this really intricate, highly tuned global supply system with leverage that is hundreds of percent of global GDP. And so basically, it's, I think a good way to look at it is the long-term debt cycle, which is popularized by Ray Dalio. And so that's kind of the overall framework for why the 30s and the 40s looked the way they did, right? So you had specific factors like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. You had obviously the war in the 1940s, but many of things were actually interrelated, right? So basically a lot of the conflict in the 1940s was because of a lot of the stagnation and populism of the 1930s. Obviously it expressed itself in different ways in different countries. And so what we're finding now is that if you look at the kind of the framework of the long-term debt cycle, that's why we're seeing some of these echoes happen here, that it's not specifically the virus, it's not specifically, the financial crisis could have happened another year, but it's specifically the fact that so much leverage is built up in the system, first private debt, and now we're kind of moving on to the public debt portion, that has its own set of consequences. And the actual, the specific shape of that can take multiple forms based on policymaker decision, based on luck, on random events. But the overall kind of fragilities were already there.
You think if the government goes on with continued stimulus, how do you see, is this really going to start to trigger off inflation?
Well, we already start to see now that for example, we have the highest core CPI year over year since 1992. Just got reported. CPI is touching about 5%. I think that's not the perfect measure of inflation, but even using that official metric, it's running kind of hot at the moment. Part of that is from base effects. Part of that is from basically a pretty significant increase in broad money supply combined with some supply shortages. So overall, my base case is that it's probably going to come in waves, right? So instead of just seeing this persistent inflation month after month go up and up, it's going to be waves depending on whether we're doing fiscal stimulus or not. And so, for example, as we look out later this year, some of the fiscal stimulus starts to wear off, right? So people are not getting stimulus checks, they're not getting, these PPP loans turn into grants. Congress is kind of in gridlock at the moment, so we'll see what happens with infrastructure. It's hard to say when that will pass, what the magnitude will be. My base case would probably be that they'll do something before the midterms, but that's certainly a slower kind of draw out of money compared to stimulus checks that are more like an adrenaline shot right away. And so I think we have to watch things now like wage inflation, as well as the tightness of the energy market, right? So one of the things kind of holding down inflation over the past year was that we've had a lot of excess oil supply, and in many cases we still do, but because we have not had a lot of capex for a variety of reasons, I think as we look out a little bit further, the energy market can get tighter in the years ahead. And so overall, I think that it won't be a straight line. I think we'll have periods of inflation, periods where it cools off again, and then it partially comes down to what fiscal policymakers do, because like the 40s, this is a very fiscal driven type of inflation, whereas the 70s was a somewhat more of a bank loan type of inflation. So I think that a lot of people looking back at the 70s as their kind of model for this, whereas actually I think that the 40s are the closest example we have of this sort of period.
Point. Speaking of the 40s, that massive fiscal response to World War II resulted in a ton of industrial production like tanks, planes, weapons, and supplies to support the war effort. Today, though, I don't think there was a similar quantity of goods, let's say, produced from this fiscal response. Would that point make any difference in your comparison to the 1940s and 2020s?
Well, I think there's a couple things both in favor and against. And so on one hand, the 40s had stronger demographics, which were more inflationary. And as you pointed out, a lot of that was to boost production, which, you had a period where, for example, you put a lot of money into the economy, you get commodity shortages, and so you get these periods of inflation. But then in the long run, as you built those factories and as you increased the production, that put downward pressure on inflation.
Before we continue, help us by smashing that YouTube like button and subscribe now to this channel. This shows the algorithm that you value the information, and it helps us spread this message. Sharing is caring. Please like and subscribe now. Thank you. And now, let's continue.
The other hand, here in the 2020s, on some cases we have software is very deflationary. The demographics are older and more deflationary, and so some forces are actually stronger deflationary. But then, as you pointed out, a lot of the stimulus efforts that we're doing, they're mostly just kind of changing the ratio of money supply compared to debt in the markets, which is something I've been talking about for a few years. And so it's kind of this anti-deflationary force, kind of unraveling parts of the debt bubble that's happening. And that has its own inflationary consequences. But if you look back in history, every inflationary decade, pretty much by definition, has supply constraints. That's how it works. You get a significant increase in broad money supply that boosts demand in all sorts of ways. But for whatever reason, some aspect of supply is unable to keep up because the investments were not well timed or misplaced, or there's some sort of geographical issue. And so, for example, in the 1970s, you had oil shortages, partially based on geopolitical reasons, also just because growth is very quick in some cases, and so you just kind of ran out of oil capacity. But a lot of it was the geopolitical aspect. In the 1940s, you had commodity shortages, right? Because you needed pretty much every scrap of commodity you could get. The increase in the broad money supply due to the fiscal stimulus basically created all this demand that might not otherwise be there, and so you ran into real world constraints. And so what we're seeing in the 2020s is that people got stimulus checks, people got unemployment benefits, and that was able to increase demand. But then you start running into real world constraints. It could be paper towels, you ran out of those. It could be certain food items, especially meats and things like that. It could be energy's not really been super tight, but for example, a lot of commodities have been pretty tight. Shipping capacity has been tight. Semiconductors have been tight because there's only a handful of countries in the world that produce most semiconductors. And so we are kind of running into some of these real world constraints. And that's not an exception to inflation. That's part of why inflation happens.
And you touched on geopolitical especially. Wouldn't all hell break loose inflation-wise if we did have some geopolitical hotspots, even World War III added into the mix in this decade?
Almost certainly, yes. I mean, right now, for example, a lot of our supply chains in the United States are intertwined with China. The same is true for Europe and China. Singapore, for example, is a really big hotspot for global trade. We have a very interconnected world. There are some countries that are a little bit more isolated than others in terms of, say, trade as a percentage of their GDP. Like India is a little bit, lower on that percentage. Japan is a little bit lower on that percentage. But a lot of those, the trade that happens is essential things like semiconductors. And so, if you were to have kind of a tail risk of really kind of bad breakdowns in terms of geopolitical relationships, that would certainly be inflationary. And also, I mean, even in a more gradual sense, the past 25 years, part of what's held down certain types of inflation is the globalization that we've done. And so, for example, things like education, healthcare, childcare, we've had very strong inflation in those sort of service-oriented things. But things that we were able to outsource to cheaper markets, like electronics manufacturing, broad kind of cheap manufacturing, those prices have been very low. And so if we start to, we've kind of hit the end of that road, I think, in terms of how much we can do. And it's one of those things where that's had different impacts on different types of workers. And so, for example, that's been pretty good for the upper 10% of society that doesn't really make things, but then benefits from those cheaper products. But that's been pretty bad for, say blue collar workers that would otherwise have made those products in the United States. And so I think there's more of a political will to pull some of the supply chains back to be less reliant on external countries. And one of the kind of the risks of that, you get a lot of benefits from it. You get increased resiliency, you get increased local work, but then you also are likely to get higher prices for some of those things because you're not outsourcing to whatever market is the cheapest.
What to do in such a situation? Inform yourself and keep your financial education strong. We from the Compact Group offer our loyal subscribers a free educational portal with first-hand monetary, financial, and economic knowledge. Enter our invite-only Insider Club by clicking the link below. You will get access to first-class information far earlier than the rest. We have prepared a special deal for all our members where you can access a giant pool of Robert Kiyosaki's financial wisdom for just $1. To find out more, simply click the link below and join our Insider Club absolutely free. But there is more you can and should do. Build up several streams of income. More and more people realize that they have to take their future in their own hands, but they don't know how and where to start. We from Compact offer our Insider Club members unique opportunities. Strengthen your financial muscle and get the edge. Click the link below. Become part of our free Insider Club. No financial obligations. But there's one important thing you have to know. You have to become active. So do it now. Become active and see you on the other side.